As fun as old kits are, they just can't hold a match to the new super kits of today. I mean, these things are just better in every way. Did you hear that? The hell can that be? Yeah, let me grab a flashlight. I think it's coming from outside. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today to welcome you all to another episode of Aurora Park. For this episode, we have two of these Atlantis reissued Aurora JS3 Stalin Heavy tanks. One of the models in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, the other one is built for private commission and belongs to a private collector. Although these models here are 1/48 scale, they're slightly outside of my normal purview. However, typically I take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Just like in the other Aurora Park video, where one of the models was built completely stock, out of the box, with almost no additions or modifications that have been made, while the other example was upgraded well past its original kit configuration to further enhance the detailing that's found on the model's surface. We'll be going over all of these features as well as also giving the model a thorough in-box review in this video, so stay tuned because there's going to be a ton of content coming right at you. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around these two models. And these two vehicles here are the Russian JS3 Stalin Heavy tank. The JS3 was probably the best Russian heavy tank design of World War II, and I'll even go so far as to say it's probably the best heavy tank design during that era. When you see one of these vehicles, it's almost as if you get the idea that the designers were done screwing around with the Germans and they wanted to create the heaviest, most heavily armed and armored vehicle that they can possibly produce. This vehicle wasn't exactly alone in this trend, however, because at the same time in the late 40s, all three of the major Allied powers had a vehicle along similar lines. The US had the M46 Patton, the British had the Centurion, and of course the Russians had the JS3. Also, just like with the other two vehicles, the JS3 really came into service towards the 11th hour during World War II. Not so much with the M46, but this is definitely true with the Centurion. A few combat units did receive the JS3 Stalin III, but basically the war ended almost about 30 minutes after the vehicles entered officially into service. The JS3 Stalin III was heavily influenced from its predecessor, the JS3 Stalin II, and of course that vehicle has its lineage with the KV series. However, the JS3 was radically different compared to the JS2 counterpart. What's also really interesting is that the JS3 was going to set the mold forth on how the Soviets would design tanks from this point onward. The JS3's design was going to influence Soviet tank designs from the late 1940s all the way up until really the very recent history of the newest Russian tanks that are entering into production and fielding today. The vehicle was designed originally in 1944, but it didn't enter into production until the following year. The vehicle was in production for a relatively short period of time, ceasing in 1947. In total, about 2,300 and change units were produced. The vehicle had a combat weight of little over 51 tons, which was massive for the time. Also, the majority of that weight was with the armor. The vehicle had excellent armor protection, and it was a big step up compared to its predecessor, the JS2. What made the JS3 unique was exactly how the armor plates were configured. Rather than using cast components for some of the front armor sections, as what was seen on the predecessor, the JS3 utilized mostly flat plate, but what was unique was with the way they were angled. The vehicle had an extreme angular hull, which protected all of the surfaces from the front to the sides to the rear. For the vehicle's turret, a single cast turret was developed, just like the T-34-85 as well as the JS2. However, unlike those vehicles, the JS3's turret was going to be much lower in profile and have this upside down bowl type UFO look to it. Because of this shape, this gave excellent ballistic protection. However, this was at the detriment of interior space as well as also ammunition storage. To power this beast, a Kharkiv Model V2 V12 diesel engine was utilized. With this engine, the vehicle was able to get a top speed of a blistering 23 miles an hour. Considering, however, that the vehicle weighed in at 51 tons, this was actually pretty impressive. For armament, the JS3 was also very well equipped. Its main armament consisted of a single D25 122mm main gun. This was the same armament that was utilized on the JS2 to great effect at dealing with German heavy tanks during the war. For secondary armament, it utilized a coaxial DT machine gun, which was chambered in the Russian 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridge. For the anti-aircraft protection, it utilized the 12.7mm Dushka heavy machine gun. Although the JS3's service life was somewhat limited in World War II and its production run was also stinted, a decent number of these vehicles were still produced. The Soviet military kept on using these vehicles for several decades to come, even into the 1950s and 60s, where they had life extension programs incorporated in order to squeeze out a little bit more service life from this vehicle. Outside of Soviet use, the vehicle was exported to a few Warsaw Pact countries, and even several wound up in Egypt, where they squared off against the Israelis during the Six-Day War. Although by this time the JS3 was an antiquated vehicle, it was still proving to be very difficult to knock out by the Israelis, both with bazookas as well as with the main guns from the M48A2 patents. Eventually, the Israelis did find a way to knock these vehicles out, but it wasn't for the lack of trying. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when these two models were first started to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here are the models at the start of the build. For the base starter kits, I'll be utilizing these 1/48 scale vintage former Aurora JS3 Stalin 3 kits that are now from the company Atlantis. And of course, since they are the same kit, no need to have the second one cluttering up the table. Just like I mentioned on the previous Aurora Park video with the M46 patent, Atlantis is a plastic model company that is re-releasing many of the old vintage plastic model kits that were originally from Aurora. The JS3 Stalin 3 here obviously falls into that category. And just like with the Aurora M46, this kit here is a very, very old tooling model kit. Aurora went ahead and originally tooled up the JS3 kit back in 1956. To put things in perspective, this kit here was released only a couple years after the Korean War. To really make this model any more interesting, you have to keep in mind the uphill battle that Aurora must have had when they were tooling up and designing this kit here. 1956, the Cold War is really in the thick of it, and getting access to Russian or Soviet-made equipment wasn't exactly as easy as it is, well, today. Come to think of it, I'm not even sure if there are any examples of the JS3 that were outside of the Iron Curtain, or let alone in the United States, at the time Aurora was tooling this kit up here. The only JS3 Stalin 3 that has been in the United States for the longest period of time was the example housed in the Aberdeen Proving Ground Tank Collection. That vehicle may or may not have been in the US at the time Aurora was tooling up this kit here. I'm a little hazy on the vehicle's background, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe that vehicle was captured by the US military either in the Korean War or possibly was handed over to the US government by the Israelis as they captured a bunch of examples of them during the Six-Day War timeframe. So I'm a little hazy on that information. If anyone does know, of course, feel free to put that in the comment section listed below. Although I will state, I did see that vehicle in person a number of years ago, and I must say it is a very impressive and imposing vehicle if you ever get to see one in the flesh. It's pretty astounding. It's basically a giant boulder sitting on tracks. But I could go and digress into that information on another video. So with all of this very limited information that was out there in the West of this particular vehicle at the time, Aurora went ahead and basically cobbled together the kit in question here. With this information in mind, the vehicle is going to have several inaccuracies compared to some of the other vehicles in the Aurora lineup. Again, totally understandable for the lack of any sort of resources at the time. Modern equivalent would be, well, if you're trying to fabricate or scratch build any of the North Korean military vehicles or main battle tanks that they have, you're probably going to be in a similar situation as Aurora was here when they tooled up this JS3. Just like with all the other Aurora tank kits, they are completely comprised of parts made from injection molded plastic, with the only non-plastic parts being the single piece bands for the flexible tracks, which of course you'll see once I crack the box open. Like I previously mentioned, the JS3 kit came out in the mid-1950s and stayed in production with Aurora all the way up through the 1960s and even into the mid-1970s timeframe, when, just like with many of the other Aurora tank kits out there, production ceased when the company, I believe, switched over hands to Monogram, if I'm not mistaken. For the longest period of time, the JS3, along with the other Aurora tank kits, have been very hard to find, and when found were basically commanding collector prices. But within the last year or so, Atlantis went ahead and decided to re-release this kit here, along with several of the others. This kit here and the M46 Patton are currently the two most accessible of the Atlantis X Aurora kit offerings, in specifically military vehicle format. And this one here I purchased off of Amazon.com. Unlike the M46 Patton, which I was able to track down and procure from a Hobby Lobby, with the JS3 here, that's not necessarily the case, or at least it's not the case for the Hobby Lobbies in my area. Just like with the M46, the kits retail anywhere between 20 to about $25 US, and, you know, some change in between. Just like with the other Atlantis kit that I touched upon before, Atlantis went ahead and resurrected one of the earliest box arts for this particular kit. Unlike the M46 Patton, where basically there was only 2, possibly 3 different box arts available, for the Joseph Stalin 3 there were a few more as the years progressed. I'm not sure if this was the first or second pattern of box art, but it is definitely one of the earlier versions. Eventually they would replace this box art altogether with one that was illustrated by that famous illustrator that I mentioned in the other video, and I actually have an example of one of those box arts so you can easily see it once I compare the two together. Just like with the other Aurora kits, at the time Aurora had this very thin, narrow, rectangular style box, and this here would have been the box art, or the basically similar to the configuration you would have found it in. The main difference between the original one and the Atlantis is that Atlantis went ahead and made the box a little bit wider so they could put their other graphic design up here without it hindering any sort of the box art in question. The original Aurora kits, on the other hand, they went ahead and had their logo found in the lower corner here, as well as a few other of the information that generally is found on the box arts of plastic model kits. So with this in mind, you actually have a nice clean box art right here for you to enjoy. The box art itself is, you know, good for what it is. Keep in mind, this box art definitely dates back to the mid-1950s, and with the color and the styling used, it is definitely a product of that era. Carry on with the remainder of the graphic designs, just like with the M46 kit, where we have the white banner with the Atlantis logo, the title. The kit is, of course, made in the USA, which is actually a pretty interesting thing to point out. The skill level, and then here we have all of the features that are supplied with this kit. Carry on further, takes to the side tab. Here we have just a basic thumbnail of the box art on the front, with, again, more information on the side. On this corner here, we have some more corporate information, and this little chart type setup here is very similar to what we see on monogram kits of the current era. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Monogram may be the ones who are producing these kits, but again, it's hard to say, and if anyone does know, feel free to put that in the comments section listed below. On the reverse side, we have another thumbnail view, and then on the tab over here, or I should say on this section of the box, we have here a photograph of a built sample model, along with the barcode, and also another hand-drawn silhouette of the Joseph Stalin 3. Let's put a pin in this because I'm going to be revisiting that in a moment. As for the photograph, it's hard to say, but I think that photograph is actually about 40 or 50 years old. And what's interesting is that whoever built this model built it in a parade type format where we have the edging as well as the rims of the wheels painted in white. If anyone knows a thing or two about these Russian tanks, on the May Day parade that they have every year, they tend to have them in this type of configuration. Which makes sense because chances are whoever designed this kit here was really trying to study those photographs of this vehicle at the time. And during that era, like I stated before, the best photographs you're going to get were at the Victory Day parade in Moscow. So with that all out of the way, let's go ahead and crack the box open to show the kit contents. And the model itself is all concealed in this little bag that we have right here. Let me go ahead and crack it open so I get to show the details in better light. With the parts all dumped out, here you can see what the parts look like on their sprues. And the first thing that jumps out, well, particularly to me, is the color that the plastic is molded in. This thing is molded in this Christmassy Swamp Thing type green, which is actually a color that was very similar to the ones found on some of the OG kits that were released back in the day. Just like with the M46, the parts are very simplistically molded, and you do have a bit of flash found on some sections of the runner, but again, this is something that was a common feature that was found on these kits back in the day. The manlet was just dangling on the runner, but here you can see it up close. Note, there is a substantial sinkhole found on the bottom portion, as well as on the top portion over here. This is far from being a deal breaker, and again, it's just one of the quirks that are going to be encountered on working on one of these older tooling type kits. This is something that is easily taken care of with a little bit of bodywork, and I'll be touching upon that later as the video progresses. As for the upper body itself, here you get to see the quality of the molding and detailing. Again, very, very, very rudimentary, but again, it's understandable for the era. Like we have here what we all know as the front hatch, but on here it's just a small little circle molded onto the plate. And we do have some side details here molded in, and I'll be touching upon that in a moment. But the same side detailing is present on the reverse side. The next runner takes to the turret casting. Note it does have the round UFO shape, which is, of course, iconic for the Joseph Stalin 3. They even went ahead and molded on the little grab handles, which is another iconic bit of detailing found in this pattern of tank. If I'm not mistaken, I believe they got the number of grab handles correct, which is, something to commend them on. The top portion of the turret, admittedly, is a bit sparse on any sort of detailing, and we'll be talking about that as the build goes on. Next runner down takes to the lower turret pan, as well as the components for the sprockets. Pretty simple, but just like with the M46, the sprocket is an actual sprocket with molded teeth that are separate from the actual rim itself. On some of the older kits from the era from other companies, the sprocket was basically just a cylinder and had a drawing of a sprocket that was molded on. On the Aurora kits here, that wasn't the case. You actually got a real sprocket. Now, in 2021 eyes, the sprocket teeth are inaccurate, and the sprocket itself may be out of scale, but again, we're talking about a kit here that was released in 1956, so, bear that in mind. Moving down further takes to the lower pan. Just like with the M46, the hull is a multi-piece construction where you have the bottom, the sides, the rear, and the top, and it all gets puzzled together to give you the shape of the vehicle. What's interesting to point out is that they went ahead and molded in the original copyright information for the Joseph Stalin 3. Note the date is 1976. Like I said before, the kit is much older than that, but just like with the monogram M48A2, at some point in the mid-70s, they started to put the copyright information for that date at that time. So this is something that's not necessarily out of place on this type of tooling. But 1976, Aurora Products Corporation, and it has the name of the original factory that Aurora had. Other details that are relevant on the runner is the rear plate here. Not too bad. It definitely has the look and appearance of the rear plate found on the Joseph Stalin 3. The DSHK, not so much. It actually kind of looks like something you would see on the World War II's tanks that, I seem to post every April Fool's Day. And the extended fuel tanks are really, really caked over with a nice little layer here of flash. So that's going to be fun removing. And I mean that unironically. It's fun to carve away these big, wide areas of plastic, revealing the part underneath. Moving down further takes us to the lower hull suspension parts. Just like with the M46, the suspension is integrally molded into the side hull, and they do a decent job, giving for what they are. Here we have the tow cables. They are molded in plastic, which is a trait that is present on several other more modern kits, and this is true for kits even, that you see today. But again, it shows you how ahead of the curve Aurora was back during this era. The last runner are the road wheels, and to their credit, they went ahead and molded in the little elaborate angular rigidity strip shape that are found on the Joseph Stalin pattern of road wheels. The numbers appear to be correct, but again, we'll see exactly how that pans out as the build goes on. They are a two-piece assembly, which is quite standard on most of the tank model kits that are out there. And the last plastic runner gives us the hubcaps, the rollers, and also the front idlers. And this is probably the biggest ding that this kit has, in my opinion, aside from the dimensions of the turret, which I'll touch upon later. But the Stalin kit from Aurora went ahead and molded a pair of front idlers that are much larger compared to the ones found on the remainder of the road wheels. Of course, as we know, the Joseph Stalin 3 utilized a front idler wheel that was the same casting as the main road wheel. So this is a ding on the kit. This may or may not be something that I address on my example of the Joseph Stalin 3, but again, we'll see as the video goes on. On the very bottom of the box, we have here that little siren, which is a bit of detailing that's commonly found on the side of Russian vehicles. And we also have a travel lock, and from my understanding, I believe the travel lock is functional, where it can pivot up and down. So that's it with the plastic parts. The tracks, like I stated before, are made from a single piece of flexible vinyl. And here you get to see the detailing found on these parts. What's really interesting is that on the JS3 kit, they actually went ahead and molded on the detailing found on the inner track sections, as well as the outer track sections. And this may not sound revolutionary, but back in the day, it wasn't until the mid-70s to probably the 80s when Tamiya started doing this type of system on their own tracks. So that is something to keep in mind. The tracks themselves are very, very rudimentary, but again, they give you the look and feel of the Joseph Stalin 3 track that we all know and expect. And on the bottom of the box, here we have a set of water slide decals, and apparently this kit gives you enough decals to render this model in probably about 3 different options, with also 2 different type of countries. We have here a couple examples from the Soviet Union, as well as also, which is today known as the Czech Republic, but back then, of course, was Czechoslovakia. The markings themselves, the quality looks to be decent, basically average what you expect. They are a bit shiny on the paper here. However, from my experience on the M46 patent, when they were applied to the model, when the model was varnished over with the VMS flat varnish, it actually did a really good job with making everything blend in. So hopefully I get similar results with this kit here. And on the very bottom of the box, we have here a set of instructions. These are definitely not original, and again, have this monogram type look and feel to them. If anyone have ever built the monogram kits, you should know exactly what I'm referring to. Having said that, the quality of the illustrations look to be pretty good and, are pretty self-explanatory. And on the bottom portion here, you get to see 2 other kits in their lineup, the 8-inch howitzer, as well as the M46 patent, which of course, I already touched upon several times in this video. So now that you saw what the current Atlantis reissue kit looks like, let's go ahead and compare and contrast that with an OG Aurora Joseph Stalin 3 tank that was released in the mid-1970s. This one here, of course, was sitting in my collection for a number of years and will be the subject matter of another upcoming video. Starting with the box art, this one here, as you can see, they completely changed the style compared to the older pattern, with this more dramatic one that we have here. This one was painted by that illustrator that I touched upon before, and again, it just has his quality written all over it. As I stated before, the original Aurora releases came in these very narrow rectangular boxes, but in the mid-1970s, they went ahead and changed the format to these cube patterns that we have here. The reason for the change-up was for a couple reasons. One was for shelf space, in a retail store setting, but the other was because of what the later kits supplied you with. The original kits here just gave you the kit, basically the parts I showed, and that was all you got. With this generation over here, in addition to giving you the exact same kit, they also went ahead and gave you a vacuum form base that was a diorama display. The piece was made from vacuum form plastic, and then you would just go ahead and paint it, and you would display your model on it once it was fully completed. Getting back to the graphic design, like I stated before, this pattern of box art is very, very dramatic with this fiery, smoky background in the back. And the tank is very Hollywood-esque, shall I say, with the giant red star painted on the pike nose, as well as the other red stars painted on the turret. There's no allusion to which country this tank belongs to. We have here the giant A Aurora logo, as well as the typical typeface, which were found on the Aurora kits of this era and even the previous eras that came before. At least with this kit here, it actually is the vehicle in question that you get, as opposed to that M46 kit, where they have a gorgeous M48A1 on the box art, but of course, that's not the kit that you get inside the box. Anyway, on this side portion here, takes us to this little illustration of the JS3 Stalin 3. And if I can refresh, right here, you can see that exact same graphic that has been recycled from this box art that we have right here. Opening up the contents, we'll have two JS3 Stalin 3 kits in here. Pay no attention to this one. This is going to be the subject matter of a upcoming old tank repair video. But here we have a partially assembled JS3 Stalin 3 in the box. And if we compare and contrast that with the modern tooling one, you have to see a few differences. Probably the one thing that will immediately jump out at you is the color of the plastic. The new one here is made from this neon green type coloring, while the old one here has a more traditional olive drab type coloring. Now, like I stated before, many of the older generation kits did not have this OD coloring and instead had a color similar to this. What I meant by that? Well, if I take a look at this example here, you can see the original color of the plastic in question. This kit was actually older tooling compared to the one here found in the box. And if I flip it over, you can see that the colors between the old and the new are very, very similar to each other, although admittedly the older one is a different shade, but you can see exactly where they were going with it. Back to the two unbuilt ones, you get to see the quality of the molding compared from the new one and the old one. Note the engine grills are identical, as well as the front detailing. One change, however, that was made between the new and the old kits involved these side sections that we have here. On the original old school tooling, you'll note that the sides are completely smooth with no detailing on them whatsoever. But on the new JS3 Stalin 3 kit, you'll see that they went ahead and molded on the lockers that are found on the side sections. This is actually a very interesting bit of detailing that was added because this same feature was done to the real JS3 Stalin 3s. In case someone out there doesn't realize, and also not to spoil a future model showcase video that's going to be posted on this channel, during the post-war years, the Russians themselves went ahead and made this modification to their JS3 Stalin 3s. If I'm not mistaken, I believe this one with this type of configuration is known as the JS3M, but more information on that, of course, is to follow. But basically, the JS3 shape is very deceptive with the shape of its outward appearance. If you look at the JS3, you'll see, wow, it looks like it has very thick armor on this slope type design, and this side armor here is just as thick as the frontal armor and the armor that you see on the vehicle. Well, in actuality, that's not exactly the case. The side is very heavily angled, yes, but it's not in this section. It actually bends inward and then goes down. The side section that we have here is made from thin sheet metal, and it's actually hollow on the original JS3, which was why it was pretty easy for them to go ahead and retrofit adding these lockers that were built into the side sections. Along with adding the details that we have here, Atlantis also added these two chevron-shaped objects found on either side. Other than that, however, the pieces are basically the same, but again, the Atlantis one is slightly more polished compared to the old school release. With comparing the turrets, you can also see how Atlantis made a few more little tweaks to the old school tooling. On the Aurora one here, you'll notice that it is identical to the Atlantis in dimensions, as well as also with the majority of the detailing found on the sides, as well as the rear portion of the roof. Even the machine gun hole is in the exact same location. What's different is with the front portion that we have here. On the original Aurora, this area is completely smooth with no detailing present, while on the Atlantis we have these small little bits of detailing molded on. On the inside here, they look to be identical with the exception of this number 20 found on the newer one, while on the older one there are no numbers present at all. Some other parts look to be exactly the same, like the single piece plastic molded barrel, which I didn't touch upon before, but it's a decent piece of equipment. You do have the length and the look and feel of the main gun found on the JS3, and the muzzle brake is present, and the side baffles are molded hollow. However, just like with the 46, the front section is molded solid, but again, this is something that is very easily addressed. Rear plates are identical to one another. Only change I see is again on the inside. The newer kit, they gave you a number, while on the older kit, they are not. I guess they figured they just need a drawing of these parts and people will be able to basically cobble it together from there, and they didn't need literal numbers pointing at pieces on the runner in order to complete the build. Comparing the quality between the old and new tooling for the road wheels, you'll see that they are identical with each other, with the same type of quality of molding and details. The one difference that I see on this 1970s era kit involves the bottom portion of the turret as well as the hull. On this one here, you'll note that there's this large hole that's found on the bottom plate, and then we have this descending tower found on the bottom portion of the turret. I'm not exactly sure why these pieces are here, if it's clearance maybe for a tank commander figure, but that doesn't seem to be the case because the older one here that I'll touch upon in a moment didn't have any of these features present, and it still originally had a TC figure. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that Aurora had this feature where there was like a telescope or some kind of lens thing that you could actually look through the model. I've never seen one in person, but I've seen examples of the box art that I'll go ahead and throw up right here on the corner. If anyone knows exactly what this thing did or does, let me know in the comments section below. But this bit of detailing, or I should say this feature here, is not present on the Atlantis kit. However, if you look carefully in the light, you should see a large circle found in this section over here, which looks to be remnants of that hole that's right over here that are found as artifacts on the tooling. It's very, very, very subtle, and 90% of people there probably wouldn't even notice it, but if I compare the two, and if the camera focuses just right, you'll see the little faint lines of the original tooling compared to the new release one here. On the bottom portion of the turret, let's see if that's the case. Here it is. Yep, you can see that the turret originally must have been made from this molding, or these molds, or maybe even an example of this older kit, and they reverse engineered it. But you can see exactly how they plated it off and amputated that descending section. Now, why this is relevant is because on this example here of the Aurora JS3, it's actually an older version. And if I take the top off, you will see that that provision is completely absent on this example. Not even a trace or any sort of artifacts left behind. Even on the lower plate, absolutely nothing. So that's actually a very interesting feature that they built into this model over here. What's also very interesting is, like I said before, they went ahead and molded this information, the original Aurora information, found on the bottom portion of the lower hull. But, interestingly enough, that information is not found on the original bottom plate that we have here with the hole that obviously this one here was adapted from. To make things even more interesting, here we have the older Aurora kit, and as you can see, there is absolutely no copyright or any sort of information that is found on the inside. So, if anyone has an idea for why or what this is here for, again, feel free to put that in the comment section listed below. If I was to take a guess, perhaps this example here was one that came in the later years, and so Aurora themselves plated up that hole, amputated it completely, and then they went ahead and put this corporate information. So this one maybe comes tooling after this one, as well as after the other one that I have here in the box. Again, totally speculation, but it is something interesting to think about. The last thing to compare are the tracks themselves. This one here is from the re-release, and this one here is from the original one. The tracks themselves are identical in terms of the molding and detailing, and the material is similar. This one, though, is a bit more flexible compared to the older one, and from what I understand from what other people tell me, the stiffer tracks was actually common on these older Aurora kits, and it's not something that just happened over time as the vinyl or the rubber, began to get up there in age. Which, by the way, the flexible material is actually more appreciated compared to the stiffer one. It makes building the model a little bit easier, and like I stated in the M46 video, it makes the model roll or push all that much more easier. And here's the customer's model, fully assembled, and at this point here, it's ready to slide off into painting and completion. One of the stipulations that I mentioned before that the customer requested for this build was it to be as close as possible or as much as possible of the out-of-the-box configuration. Admittedly, I did deviate in one or two locations, but, we all know I can't help myself in that regard. However, I will be touching upon that as the video goes on. But what you see here is, by and large, what the kit gives you. With the model at this point, I do want to touch upon a few things that anyone who's building one of these kits may encounter, as well as what to look out for. Just like with many of the other Aurora models, keep in mind these kits date back to the 1950s, 1960s time frame, and as we know back then, fit on plastic models was not as nearly precise as what we expect and see on kits of today. So when you assemble one of these models, part of the charm will be dealing with some of the bodywork as well as removing some gaps. On the bow pike nose over here, this is probably the most substantial that you'll see when assembling this model. With the way the kit is assembled, like I stated before, it is in 3 pieces, technically 4 with the rear plate here. But when you assemble these parts, you will have some seams where these sections all interact. And this is really brought to attention right here on the pike nose. As you can see, I went ahead and did a little bit of body work with some red putty, and this was just added to the appropriate locations and then just polished away with some sandpaper. Once all the sanding is done, you're all good to go and the model can then progress further. Along with the bodywork on the pike nose, you can see some other bodywork right here on the rear plate. And on that note, you could also see that there were a handful of little injection pin marks or knockout marks that need to have been addressed as well. This is easily tackled with a little bit of putty as well as some sanding. No tools were used. This was all done by hand with some sandpaper. Fortunately, the knockout marks are fairly shallow, so polishing them away is not really a tedious task. While on the hull, another thing to point out are with the extended fuel tanks. The kit has quite a bit of flash found on some of these components, as well as a seam that separates where the molds all joined. And luckily, these are also fairly easily polished away with just some sandpaper and a little bit of elbow grease. This was done to all 4 of the gas tanks, and once done, the thing looks absolutely seamless. Taking this next to the turret, as you can see, very simple assembly. The one thing that did stick out at me was the amount of putty work that needs to be done to the mantlet. The mantlet did have some sink marks, as I touched upon before, but now you can see what they look like all polished away. Where I went ahead and added some things to this model involved with the mantlet as well as with the main gun. Note the barrel section has been drilled out. And I also went ahead and added the provisions for the optic as well as the coax machine gun. And these were just simply added with a Dremel and a number of Dremel bits. And that was basically it. Outside of one other change that I added, which is a bit of an improvement, is to the commander's hatch itself. The commander's hatch is fully functional on the model. However, one quirk that the Aurora kit does have is that the hatch doesn't really get held in place by anything positive. It just utilizes the geometry here of the hinge mechanism for the piece to snake in, and then once in place, theoretically it holds it in both the open or closed position. However, in practice, the piece tends to fall out more often than not, so rather than having that be a problem, I just took a small little piece of Plastruct, glued it on the bottom portion of the hinge mechanism, which seals it off, but it allows the hatch to still be fully functional. The barrel also had some seam work done on it. The barrel is a one-piece molding, but there's that small little ridge that I touched upon before. It's very easily removed with a little bit of sandpaper. So, that's basically it for the out-of-the-box variant. Let's go ahead and pan over to the vehicle from my personal collection that's been, shall we say, ECA-ified. And here's the second JS3, only this one here has been heavily modified from the stock original format with the ECA detail package. At this point here, this one is also ready for painting, and before I go ahead and take it into those steps and completion, let's go ahead and take a look at the ECA detail set to see exactly what it gives you in order to enhance the stock Aurora tooling model. And here are all the detail components that I'm going to fit to the model in order to enhance it from the stock original offering. All these pieces over here are made in HD 3D printed materials, and just like with the parts for the M46 patent, this here is going to be offered as a set found on the ECA Shapeway store. On the Shapeway store, I have all of my 1/35 scale and 1/48 scale detail components for the various models that I've worked on in the past. The link to the ECA Shapeway store can be found in the link below, as well as also in the video description. Zooming in a little closer, you get to see the detail components in better light. The parts that are found on this runner here are enough to equip one Joseph Stalin 3. However, you may notice that several of the detail parts are in duplicate, and this was done in case you may encounter a mishap during the course of production. And jumping back to the model, here you get to see what it looks like with all those components fitted. Well, I shouldn't say all of those components because there are a few pieces that are going to be mounted after the model is fully painted, namely the spare tracks. But you get a good idea on what the pieces look like once they're fitted in place. Let me go ahead and pop the turret off so you get to see what the hull details look like at this point. Here we have the bow driver's hatch. This was a simple drop-in install in order to prep this area. However, the molded-in blister detailing was simply deleted, and then the new hatch was just dropped directly in place. Right over here, you can see those two front toe shackles that are put in their little storage mounts. These simply just get mounted in place since there's nothing already there on the model. There's no deleting or any other polishing or prep work required. Right here we have the two front lift hooks. Obviously on the original kit one, and this is true for both the Aurora and the Atlantis, you are going to have to delete some of the original molded in details, which is pretty easily done. On the Atlantis one here, the sections are all really thick with their plastic moldings, so you're not going to have to worry about any shallow low points to contend with bodywork once the material is removed. Just simply use a Dremel and then polish away with some sandpaper, and the surface is primed for the two front hooks. On the back portion over here, you get to see what the hooks look like, and again, same thing with the front. Those two sections were removed, allowing for these two new units to be mounted in place. Another thing that has been deleted off the back is there's this little bracket here, what I guess is supposed to be a tow hitch that is found on that location. On the real JS3, that just wasn't there, and there are spare tracks located in this section. The spare tracks are going to be mounted after the model is fully painted and weathered, but in order to do that, the area here needs to be prepped by simply deleting of that molded in detailing. While on this section over here, you can see that I went ahead and scratch built the sponsons. Obviously, this is not part of the ECA 3D printed package. This was something that was just simply scratch built by myself. The sponsons are just fabricated out of thin strips of sheet styrene that were trimmed to the appropriate dimensions and then just mounted in place. By doing this, this makes the model, in my opinion, a bit more sturdier, and again, I like having my sponsons closed off and sealed up on my models. This is true for all of them, from the 148s to the 116s, the 135s, you name it, I like to have closed off sponsons. Back to the superstructure, you'll notice that I went ahead and added these two little triangular sections of thin sheet aluminum. This was done to the front as also to the back. On the JS3, the hull was a very unique and bizarre shape, and looks are very, very misleading. If you look at the JS3, you'll think that, oh, the armor comes all the way down to this point here, and then it has this nice angled section on the side similar to a T-34. Well, you'd actually be incorrect. The armor tub on the JS3 actually is very, very elaborate, where you have the armor is actually this thin little strip that we have here, and then it goes inward, and then it goes straight down for the side hull. What you see on the side portions is actually made from hollow sheet metal. The thin sheet metal was originally just there, I guess, as a space filler on the original World War II pattern of JS3. Then when the JS3s were changed to the JS3M, they added these little cuppy sections to this section over here, I guess, to put the internal space here to good use. Regardless, on the Aurora tooling kit, they never had these sections molded in any way, shape, or form. So in order to add that little bit of missing detailing, I just simply took pieces of aluminum from a soda can, really, cut it to shape and glued it into these two sections. This gives the appropriate appearance which would be found on the real JS3. Carrying on takes to the rear plate, and this is probably the most significant change that was made to the model, and that is right here on the rear hull. With the way the Aurora kit was designed, the rear hull looked more like a T-34, where you had that giant round circle hatch right there on the back. Well, on the Joseph Stalin family, that just wasn't the case. You had these two smaller hatches side by side, and then you had several other details like hinge work, where the whole panel can just hinge outward, as well as some handles and, other amendments, or I should say other accoutrements, I should say. Anyway, the Aurora tooling was really, really off, and it's probably one of the weakest aspects of the kit. So on the model here, I decided to develop a component that drops directly in place that basically corrects almost all of those shortcomings. And that is what we have right here. Here you get to see what the plate looks like now mounted to the model. And once everything is fully painted and weathered, it is going to really, really, really enhance the look of this model, elevating it from the original Aurora tooling. And we'll see that once I compare the two side by side. One thing that's really cool is that you keep the original travel lock and the piece is still fully functional, and when it's folded in place, it clears perfectly that little handle that's integrally printed onto the section right there in the middle, which the reason why it's there is so that it actually clears the real travel lock that's on the actual tank. So that was kind of a happy accident. Honestly, I didn't even think about that when I was designing it, but I guess when you do things appropriately, sometimes things line up. So that's kind of cool. On the top portion over here, we have this little strip of sheet styrene that was cut into this shape, and this was something that I lifted off of the real, or I should say not the real, but it's found also on the real JS3, but I got this idea from working on the Tamiya JS3 that is also going to be a subject matter of its own model showcase video. Back here, you can see the exhaust manifolds now mounted in place. Again, it fills in that detailing which is absent on the original Aurora tooling. The little provisions here for the axe, or I should say that little handsaw, have been deleted, again, as per the real vehicle. And on the fuel tanks, just like with the other option, or I should say the other rendition where I left it stock, I went ahead and thoroughly blended away the seams and flash that were found on these sections. On the little end points, the end cap have two little lines that are molded in that to represent the handles that are present on the real fuel canisters. Well, on this one here, one of them was deleted because there was only one found on these sections, and the one was in the middle. So the top one just simply gets carved away with an X-Acto and then polished smooth. I also went ahead and made the additions of these little bits of plastic here. On the real JS3, there would be these little turnbuckle systems that would help strap the fuel tanks to the side of the vehicle, and in 1/48 scale, just adding these little sections here, it's a nice little way to give you that little bit of extra detailing that again is absent on the old tooling. Finally, what I did to the fuel tanks was I added the little filler caps found on the top, and in order to do this, these are nothing more than simple wire brads that were just drilled in, or I should say small holes were drilled into the top portions of these canisters, and then the nails were just mounted in place and CA'd in this format. And that's really all you need to do to enhance the fuel tanks. Outside of that, it was, fairly simple and just straightforward, old school scratch building. Some other mods that I made to the hull was I added some weld beads on the front section. Now, on the real JS3, there would have been this elaborate little setup where you have a lot of these little rigidity ribs found on the top deck, but for this model here, I went ahead and left those off because once the turret gets fitted, if I go ahead and add those sections, it's just going to make contact and it's going to make the insertion of the turret pretty problematic. So I'm just going to go ahead and forego that on this particular example and just leave in the format that we have here. However, the welds that are found on the exposed areas have been sculpted on, and these are sculpted on with a Dremel with a small little micro bit like I have right over here. And I just went ahead and just made the little indentations on the pike nose, as well as also on the forward section right here where the pike nose makes contact with the bottom plate. This will definitely come out later on after the model's fully painted, and I go ahead and go over with all those panel line accents that I generally do on my builds. This now leads us to the turret, and this is where a lot of work went into the piece. The turret, as you can clearly see, has been thoroughly coated with my cast texturing. Again, on the JS3, the cast texturing is probably one of the more noteworthy aspects of the tank's design, as it is just so rough and natural looking if you've ever seen one in real life. And I wanted to really emulate that on this build over here. And when you're doing cast texturing on this, generally on my builds, you know, you add the texturing, you have to blend it in with the sandpaper because, you know, you want to make it a little bit more refined. On Russian tanks, specifically a JS3, you can leave it a little bit coarse and it actually makes it look even better. The next thing to point out are all the little handles. You can see now that they are all fitted to the vehicle, and this immensely makes the model look so much better compared to the molded in ones that we saw previously. Of course, these are just made out of thin pieces of floor wire that were bent in place and added to the same locations that the kit had them molded on originally. Oddly enough, the kit actually did a decent job with the locations of them and their number, and the only thing I had to do was just drill out the 2 areas where the rods connect to the vehicle, and then everything was mounted in the location that you see here. And it makes, again, for a very nice enhancement. While on the sides, the next thing to point out are the lift points, which are found right here on the front, and one on the rear, and these are the ones from the ECA set that I touched upon before, and they just simply get mounted to their appropriate locations. Moving upward, you can see the periscope. Now, this was something that I actually had to carve into the turret. Because of the way the JS3 turret is designed, you have a bunch of inlets with the geometry in order to fit some of the provisions like the periscope and the antenna, and trying to get that to fit on the Aurora turret over here, you are going to have to take a little bit of artistic licensing because the turret on the Aurora tooling isn't exactly 100% accurate with the overall size and dimensions. So, you know, you have to play around with the fitting on some of these parts in order to get them in, you know, basically the generic location as they would be on the real vehicle. But as for the mounting, I took a Dremel with a small high-speed removal bit, chewed into the material over here, making this little shelf for the periscope to drop in place. Fortunately, the material on the turret here is nice and thick, so you do have some ample material to work with in order to make a carve out like you see over there. From here, he takes us to the roof, and here goes that top access plate, and on it right here, it's going to be tricky to see in this type of configuration, but once the model's painted, I'll retouch upon this. You'll see all the fasteners as well as even the lift points that are present on this piece, and the lift points are actually little tubes and are hollow. Hopefully that comes out on camera, just like they are on the real unit. This just drops directly into place, and at first I was wondering if the little slide plate here was going to interfere with this, and so far that doesn't seem to be the case. I can still elevate the main gun just fine, and it makes absolutely no contact or does it make any hindrance with this 3D printed piece that we have right here on the top. Moving forward takes us to the mantlet and the main barrel. The barrel itself I didn't really mess with. I did the exact same modifications that I made to the other variant where I polished down the seam and I drill out the front section. Other than that, these 2 pieces basically are identical to each other. The mantlet also received the exact same modifications where I added the coax and optics holes that are found on the casting, but on this one here, I went further with the addition of the cast texturing, and that's something that I fell slightly short on, again on purpose, on the other example. Moving rearward takes us to the main hatch, and this is something that you do have to make some alterations to the Aurora tooling turret in order to get to fit. The hatch itself is appropriately scaled to 1/48 scale, and the geometry is correct for this pattern of vehicle. However, the issue is with the Aurora tooling itself. The Aurora JS3 turret has a error with the rear portion with the geometry, and because of that, if you just take the ECA hatch and try to put on the roof, it's going to overhang in these 2 sections over here, and also you're going to have not a whole lot of material back here aft of the hatch, and that's actually relevant. I'll touch upon that in a second. In order to correct this with some sculptable epoxy, I added it to these 2 sections, and I also added some more right here towards the aft of the turret, creating the look that we have here. The real JS3 turret does have an appearance that looks just like this. For my epoxy sculpt, I utilized my industrial 2-part epoxy. However, if anyone wants to do this technique on their builds, I recommend using either Aves epoxy sculpt or Milliput. Both of those materials will give you the exact same results that you see right here on this example. And here are the 2 models now fully completed. The one here on the left was the one that was built exclusively out of the box, which has little modifications made to it. And the one on the opposite side was one built for my own personal collection that was really enhanced as much as you could probably take the stock kit components. The one on the left, I just want to point out, was specifically requested by the customer to be built as stock as possible because, as he put it, he wants to have a model of a model that's a model of the real one. Starting with the running gear, this one here is the example that's built totally out of the box, and you can see what it looks like with all of the kit supply components fitted. The road wheels on the model as well as the return rollers roll really, really nice, and with the flexibility of the track, you can actually push this thing across the rug. Although that kind of sounds funny, but this is something that a number of my viewers actually ask me on several of these builds from time to time. The wheels pivot really well onto the axles, and the way they are retained is with the hubcap that gets glued to the axle, thus keeping everything in. As for the detailing on the wheels themselves, they look pretty good. However, they're a bit on the KV1-ish side in terms of their overall detailing and look, and the same can also be said with the front idler. What I believe Aurora did was when they were looking up reference material for this vehicle, I think they actually went ahead and mixed the JS3 with the KV1, which was available at the time and was way more easily accessible compared to a real legit Joseph Stalin 3 tank. So I personally have seen stuff on this kit that are a mix between the two family of vehicles. By the way, not too much of a bad idea to do that. It has some logic to it, as the Stalin family is really based upon many lessons and tooling that was learned and developed for the KV1. But again, if you're building it out of the box here, the detailing is actually pretty good for what it is, and again, for this example, works just fine. On the example that I built for myself, in order to improve the vehicle's accuracy a little bit more, I went ahead and swapped out the kit supplied idler, as I mentioned earlier. Well, here you get to see what the suspension looks like with the track mounted, and honestly, it went on really, really well. I was kind of afraid that with the slightly smaller diameter wheel that I was going to add excessive slack to the track, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. The track fits on pretty well, and as it turns out, the road wheels are not that much smaller than the front return idler. Of course, if you want to enhance these models further, you could go ahead and glue the tracks to the wheels, giving you this type of sag appearance, which of course would be more appropriate for a vehicle of this type. But for this one here, I wanted to keep the original configuration of the wheels being movable as one of the features on this model. On both models, I went ahead and painted the wheels accordingly, where the rims are painted with a swipe of silver or aluminum type coloring, because as the real one is, these are made from steel and the paint would wear off on these sections very quickly, leaving for the appearance that is found on the model. On my example, one change that I made was the addition of the little mud scoop that's found right there on the rear portion, right in between the sprocket halves. This was done to both sides, and this is something that was scratch built out of a piece of wire that was flattened to the appropriate shape, and then mounted to the side of the vehicle. In order to mount it on with a pin vise, I drilled a small little hole, and then the metal piece just went in after the sprocket was installed. Jumping to the rear of the vehicle, like I touched upon before, this area received probably the most amount of work for the modification process, and if we compare and contrast that to the stock original, you can really see just how much more evolved the new component is compared to the original offering. One thing that was interesting though was on the old one, you can see that the guys who designed this kit had an idea what the details look like they did the two little lift rings found on these sections here, as well as also some of the fasteners and the hinge work. So it seems like they kind of had an idea what the pieces look like, but they weren't fully sure, because if we compare that with the way the details are supposed to look, you'll see that, again, the two lift rings are there, as are the various hinge pieces. Again, this leads to my estimation that they were trying to look at some grainy photographs from a May Day parade of a JS3, and with a little bit of guesswork and some artistic licensing, looking at a T34, they were able to cobble the design that we have here. But with the addition of that part, it really, really does improve the model tenfold. Of course, on the two examples, I did not add the tow cables found on the rear sections, but out of the box original, this was done. The tow cables are supplied with the kit, as we saw before, and they do mount on. However, in order to mount them on, I also went ahead and utilized a technique that is admittedly a bit risky, and it's one that I don't really recommend doing. If you assemble the pieces out of the box, they do go into their appropriate locations, but they don't have a good sag type appearance to them. Because of the plastic material that they're made of, they're kind of stiff and they kind of look a bit bulbous if you ever try to snap them in place. In order to get them to this sagged, form-fitting appearance that we have here, what I did was, after the pieces were mounted in place, with a careful, and I cannot stress this enough, careful hit occasionally with a heat gun on low heat, I was able to bend and melt the plastic so it's soft enough so I can contort it to the shape of the model. Like I said before, this technique is ridiculously risky, and it's one that honestly I don't recommend anyone to do, because the margin of error is so small you can easily screw it up, and if you do, it could cause some detrimental effects that'll honestly ruin the model. So don't try this at home. Don't do this technique. Even I myself wouldn't do this technique if I was to do it again. But for this one here, I guess the planets lined up and it was a gamble and it paid off. On my model, I did not want to roll the dice a second time, so I left it with the cables off of the vehicle. On both examples, the travel lock is fully functional. And the travel lock had absolutely no modifications made to it whatsoever on either of the models. It just clips right into place, and once in place, the piece works absolutely perfectly. Moving down from the rear plate, on my example here, you can see the remainder of the details, namely the appropriate shaped tow hooks, as well as also the spare track links. On the kit one, obviously those provisions are not there, or specifically with the tow hooks, they are not as well rendered as the one found on the other example, but again, for the use of the kit supplied tow hooks, they proved to work out just fine. Hopping to the pike nose, here we really see how much more improved the kit is with the extra parts compared to the out-of-the-box offering. Here you can see the out-of-the-box configuration. Everything is nice and smooth and streamlined, while the upgraded one, the piece has a lot of details which were absent on the original kit. Starting with the spare track links, these are the same pattern of spare track links that were found on the rear lower portion, only while those were individual link, these ones here are linked up in pairs, and again they have the appropriate detailing on them with the hinge mechanism, the tooth, as well as also the mounting fasteners. They just drop directly into place with no mods being made to the vehicle in any way, shape, or form. Just put a little drop of glue, drop them where they need to go, and you're done. Directly beside the track links are the two front toe shackle points, and again, the upgraded ones really do enhance the model from the stock original offering. In contrast, here we have the kit original one, and like I may have touched upon before, these toe hooks here are slightly different compared to the original OG Aurora ones from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I believe Atlantis may have made these modifications to give the model a little bit more detailing, but also I believe they did this in a way to prevent these new recreations as being passed off as originals. And this is something that is done quite often in terms of reproduction kits and, toys for that matter. While on the front of the kit original, note the original hatch detailing as well as the fender detailing, which is just smooth, and there are no other fittings found on that section. While on the upgraded one, you'll see that I went ahead and added those two 3D printed parts that I touched upon earlier. On the fender, we have the spare toe shackles on their shackle mount, and this just drops right into place like the spare tracks that I touched upon before. With the spare hatch, a similar procedure is done with the mounting. It just drops right in place. However, you are going to have to amputate that ring that was integrally molded in, like I again touched upon earlier in this video. But now, with everything fully painted, you really get to appreciate the level of detailing that are found on these small parts. As for the siren and the headlight, these are left untouched on both models. With the exception of mine, I drilled out the siren section. Maybe a little bit tricky to get on camera, but this was just hollowed out in order to improve the accuracy. And oddly enough, this is a technique that needs to be done to most of the Russian tanks on the market, specifically the ones from Tamiya. Also, before we depart from the front, here you get to see the little triangular sections that I touched upon before for the sheet metal work. And without the sections, you can see just how naked the front is in comparison. If I rotate the models to the rear side, you'll see the exact same type of thing present. Only here it's a little bit trickier to see because the cables are in the way. But on the enhanced one, it really does polish the model up to a higher degree. Moving upward to the rear engine deck, here you get to see those other details I touched upon, but again, now fully painted and weathered. This is appreciated with the exhaust manifolds, that just drop right onto the rear deck section, as well as also with the small little wire brads that I added for the filler spouts on the extended fuel tanks. Of course, the weathering was done in my usual format with a little bit of gloss black and then some gloss lacquer over it for good measure. On the rear section, I couldn't add that little bracket for the tow cable because I added a small little strip of plastic for the better geometry, which again is present on the real vehicle. If you compare that with the stock one, it is absent with those exhaust manifolds. Again, it makes for a clean engine deck, but with the addition of the small little details, it really does enhance the model compared to what the original designers anticipated when they designed this kit all those years ago. As I touched upon before, the Commander's cupola hatch is fully functional, and because of that modification that I touched upon before, you're never going to have to worry about the thing popping off when in operation. Here you can also see the kit supplied DSHK fitted. I went ahead and weathered and painted it as much as the kit tooling will allow in order to further enhance it to the best of its moldings. Basically, the machine gun itself is painted and weathered in my usual format. I painted the spade grips, and then the metal section that's on the top, as well as the remainder of the cradle, was painted with the same color of the vehicle. This is basically all you need to do to the stock tooling to get as much accuracy out of it really as possible. The antenna was also painted in a slightly different format, where the bottom portion would be rubber on the real Russian tanks, and then the top portion was painted with a different shade of black, giving you the look and difference between the two materials. Currently, as one might notice, this piece is not glued in at the moment. This was done for shipping reasons, as something like this has a really bad habit of getting snagged during shipping, and once this piece breaks, you're pretty much screwed. So for the time being, the piece is not going to be glued on, and I'm having a hard time trying to put it back in the hole. Up there we go. And once the model gets received by the recipient, he can go ahead, add a little drop of glue on that, and secure it in place in a permanent manner. But for the time being, the piece is going to be left removable. The remainder of the turret is, well, pretty much standard. On the coax, I add a little poof of flat black for the powder fouling, and of course, like I touched upon before, the main gun was drilled out because having the piece plugged is just something that everyone could agree can be altered for the best. Where things get really interesting, though, is on the opposite example. Now that the model is fully painted, you really get to appreciate the cast texturing that I touched upon before. And one thing that we all know about these Russian tanks is that cast texturing is really, really, really rough. And it just looks spectacular once it is fully painted and you really get to see every little nook and cranny found on the surface. The hatches that I touched upon before, again, now that they're fully painted, you really get to appreciate all the little fine details that are integrally printed on. Same is true for that axis plate on the front. And those two little cylindrical holes that are found on the top portion are still drilled through, or I should say are hollow as per the printing, which is a nice touch to know how much detail fidelity you can get out of a print like this. The machine gun mount is right there on the back. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a 1/48 scale vehicle-mounted DSHK machine gun. If I did, I would have definitely have incorporated on this build, but, you know, hopefully one turns up one of these days, either on Shapeways or on some other type of platform. If it does, I'll definitely make an amendment to this vehicle by adding the top machine gun, and which will really be the final cherry on top. I was contemplating on whether or not to keep the original DSHK, but for this one, obviously, I decided not to, and I'll just go ahead and wait for a good, or I should say a better rendered DSHK, and for a while it could just remain machine gunless. Also, you could appreciate the hook detailing as well as the small grab handle detailing, which is really the most iconic bit of detailing in my opinion on the JS3, and once you drill out the molded ones and replace them with wire, it greatly helps the look of the build overall. We also have that little periscope that I touched upon before, as well as the need to modify the turret geometry in order to fit said periscope in place. And again, once it's all said and done, the piece is better for it. The mantlet, nothing much to talk about there outside of what I mentioned earlier, as well as on the other build, and the main gun too has the same exact modifications made to it, so there's no point lingering on that topic. And that's basically it for the details, which now leads us into the paint and the markings. For the model's paint, both models are painted and weathered identically with the same base coat, the same weathering shades, as also with the same weathering techniques. For the base coat, it's the same Russian green that I've touched upon in a couple other World War II videos. And again, with the weathering, it's my usual washes, filters, and dry brushing, which brings it up to the look that you see here. For the model's markings, these are the kits applied water slide decals, and they prove to be very nicely done. The quality on them is very good, considering how shiny they were originally, on the decal sheet, but once they're applied to the model, they go on in a very easy and streamlined manner. And on top of that, once they are secured on or sealed on with the VMS matte varnish, they look absolutely perfect. There's really nothing more I can want out of a set of decals. They were fantastic. And if you're looking at one of these Atlantis models, be sure the decals are actually really good quality, with the caveat that you put the varnish on. If you just leave them on the surface, well, they're basically like any other water slide decal out there, only a bit on the shinier end. But again, if you hit it with the matte varnish, the pieces, or I should say the decal quality, it's one that's actually really good. From the decals, I do want to mention briefly about the model's tracks. The Caterpillar tracks on this model are the kits applied single piece vinyl tracks, and like I mentioned before, they're actually really nicely done. In fact, they're a better material compared to the ones found on the original Aurora models that I've personally seen and handled. One thing I want to mention though involves the painting, and this is true for not just these models, but basically all tank models out there with single piece vinyl tracks. You don't want to paint them with spray paints of any maker model, really. The spray paints, the chemicals in them may have a negative reaction to the rubbers used on the Caterpillar tracks, where in some cases, once the paint is applied, they will instantly start showing problems where the tracks will start falling apart, or they'll just have a negative reaction to the paint itself. Another problem with the tracks is that possibly it can lead to the tracks brittling up, dry rotting, or even just crumbling on the model as it ages. So these are things that are less than ideal. For painting single piece vinyl tracks on all models, I like to use Tamiya acrylic flat blacks. You can apply them either with a paintbrush or with an airbrush if you have the tooling, of course, and it really does solve a lot of the problems. So far, I've had very good results with using the Tamiya acrylics. None of the tracks have had detrimental issues, and all the models where I've used the paint on have been aging very well, where the tracks are just as good as they were the day I airbrushed them with the base coat. Once the base coat is done, I then went ahead and weathered them to the format you see here, and this is done with both airbrush as well as with dry brushing, and then the tracks were simply applied. When it comes to adding the varnish, by the way, this is done before the tracks are mounted to the model, so the varnish are not present on any of the track surfaces. In the end, I am extremely happy in how these builds turned out. As I've mentioned before, I am a big fan of the Aurora models, and seeing them back as a mass-produced, easily obtainable kit is something that, in my opinion, is a tad bit overdue. Although these models here are definitely products of their era, that doesn't mean that they should be discounted entirely. They have a lot of interesting quirks and features to them, and they are useful for a certain aspect of the hobby, which is a perfect way to segue us into skill level and recommendation. These models here are extremely simple. They are as beginner friendly as frankly one can possibly get. Although a beginner may have a little trouble with the alignment of the hull, as like I stated before, it is a multi-piece affair. However, if you are able to take your time with it, you should be able to put it together. These models are extremely quick to put together, and within a couple hours or so, you should have your JS3 fully built and able to be pushed across your carpet or rug. And if a beginner can tackle one of these builds, obviously so can someone with a more advanced skill set if they decide to actually go about and tackle one of these older dinosaur type builds. Of course, this leads us to recommendations, and I'll start with the person who this model is obviously not recommended to, and that would be anyone who is a scale detail fanatic. If you're the type of person who is a scale perfectionist and are looking for the utmost amount of accuracy that can be possibly found with a model kit, obviously these models here might be something to look past. These builds here are vintage model kits. No, illusions about that. And because of that, they do have certain deficiencies to them that are just not going to be found with kits that were designed with modern era tooling. And although, as we saw in this video, the model that I worked on for myself was further enhanced to basically the far extremities on what you can possibly get with the stock kit hull and turret, it will still have some certain deficiencies to it compared to something that was designed with modern era tooling, as well as also modern era research and development. But again, this is something that's kind of a charm with working on one of these older tooling kits. As for who I would recommend this kit to, well, it would be for the same type of individual that I touched upon in the last Aurora Park episode with the M46 patent. Basically, if you were the type of person that built these kits back in the good old days and are looking to recapture a little bit of that lost nostalgia, this kit here is a complete no-brainer. To add on further, because these kits are relatively easy to come by and are also relatively affordable, they make a great choice for beginner novice builders. So if you are one of those individuals that built these back in the day and you have a kid or a grandkid and are looking to get them into the world of hobbies or just, to have them do something creative on a Saturday morning or evening, these models here are really, really good for that. And also, while on that note, if you're just a person who's a novice builder and are looking to work on your skills and enhance them further, these kits here are a great way to practice a lot of those skill sets. Because these models are so relatively easy to build, it's a nice way to really get your fundamentals in order. One other attribute that these kits have that aren't really found on several of the other more advanced kits on the market is playability. These models, indeed, can be played with, although I don't necessarily recommend that, but because the tracks are so easily rotatable and the models are so simple, you're not really going to break a whole lot of parts on them. So if you're, a younger person and are looking for a model to build and also play with, well, the Atlantis kits here are something to seriously look into. Another person who I'll recommend this kit to would be anyone who's a fan of World War II Russian armor, or Russian armor in general, I guess, as well as people who are real big fans of the Stalin tank family. There are a lot of guys out there where they like to collect basically all of the available kit options for a certain vehicle type, and if the Stalin is your bag, well then this kit here would be a nice, interesting addition to your collection. I also want to add that I'm not so sure about this, but I believe that, just like with the M46 patent in the last video, that the Aurora JS3 is still, I think, the only option available for a JS3 tank in 1/48 scale. I'm not sure if Tamiya made one yet or not, but if that's the case, it's kind of funny that even after all of these years, if you're looking for a Joseph Stalin 3 in 1/48 scale, the old school Aurora kit here is still relevant today as it was back in the 50s when the kit was first designed. Another person who I would recommend these kits to would be the type of person that likes to really tinker and mess around with these type of kits. Basically someone like, myself, where, I took the stock tooling model and tried to squeeze out as much accuracy and as much detailing out of the base starter kit as humanly possible. It's something that's a niche aspect of the hobby, admittedly, but one thing about these Aurora kits is that they do leave a lot of room for improvement in a good way, and it's a blank canvas where it really allows the builder to go as nuts as they want on it in order to see exactly, again, how far they can push the detail envelope. Another thing I want to mention is that if you're the type of person that likes to do that or look into doing that, this is how you really become good at scratch building. It's because of kits like this that I built when I was younger was how I became what I am today in many regards. When I was a kid, I didn't exactly have a whole lot of money on hand, and there were no aftermarket component sets, and the ones that were out there were expensive, and when you're a little kid, you didn't have money like that, so I would find old tooling kits like this here and just, tinker with them. And by doing this, I learned how to scratch build, and many of those techniques I polished up and stuck with me all the way up until today. And, if anyone watches my YouTube channel, you'll see I do quite a bit of scratch building, and it's a skill set that has come in handy on a number of my larger and smaller scale builds. So if you're looking to go into that, old kits like this here are a really good way to enter into that foray. And finally, I would recommend this kit for anyone who's just an avid fan of collecting plastic tank model kits, specifically even vintage ones. If you have the Aurora kits in your collection and you really want to keep them pristine, but actually want to see one built and assembled, well, getting these Atlantis kits here is a great way to do that without having to crack open one of those older pieces that you may want to keep mint in its original packaging. To wrap the video up, basically, I had a blast working on these. It's always fun to work on an old Aurora kit, whether you build the model just straight up out of the box, or you go ahead and tinker with it to see exactly how far you can truly go with one. And with that, that wraps up this Aurora Park video for the Aurora/Atlantis JS3 Russian Heavy tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being Aurora Park videos like this one here, or the other smaller and larger scale content that's typically posted on this channel. Another way to keep in loop with new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of these two builds, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been published in this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/16 and 1/6 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one.